They thought the storm of grief had passed once the last hymn faded in the chapel. But inside the Whitmore mansion, the air grew even colder. Ancient portraits loomed from the walls as chandeliers flickered above a family pretending to mourn. Beneath the marble silence, there was only expectation. Everyone knew what came next. The billionaire Charles Whitmore was gone, and his legacy, worth billions, would finally be divided. Victoria adjusted the hem of her black dress like a queen awaiting her crown, while her brother Daniel tapped impatient fingers against the armrest, rehearsing in his mind the empire that would soon be his. To them, this reading was nothing more than a formality. The empire was their birthright. But on the heavy oak table, sealed beneath the crest of Harrington and Cole, lay a beige envelope that would tear apart their illusions. The family leaned forward when the lawyer cleared his throat, polishing his glasses with studied calm. His voice echoed through the hall, each word cutting like glass. The entire estate, every dollar of stock, the mansion itself, and the Whitmore Trust was to be left not to Victoria or Daniel, not to any of the blood relatives seated in their expensive mourning clothes, but to Adrian Carter, a young man who had once entered this house only as a servant. Adrian, the loyal caretaker who had washed the linen sheets, tended the fading gardens, and read aloud to Charles when illness left him too weak to turn the pages himself. For a moment, the room fell into silence so deep it seemed the walls themselves recoiled. Then the outrage erupted. Victoria rose from her chair, her voice sharp as shattered glass, insisting this was a grotesque mistake. Daniel scoffed with a cruel laugh, spitting out that Adrian was nothing but a stranger with no blood, no claim, no worth. To them, he was an outsider, an intruder who dared to exist within the same halls where generations of Whitmores had ruled. And worse, they remembered the tabloid whispers Adrian was openly gay, a detail the family had long used as a weapon to diminish him. Now, to see his name enshrined at the center of their father's fortune felt like an insult carved into stone. Adrian sat motionless, his face pale beneath the weight of so many hostile eyes. He had expected hostility, but not the venom that dripped from every word. He had been at Charles's side in those quiet, fragile nights when the world outside had forgotten the old man. He had poured tea for trembling hands, held open books for failing eyes, and carried silence with dignity when pain had stolen speech. To Adrian, those were not chores. They were acts of love, born not from bloodlines, but from the bond of two souls who understood loneliness. Yet none of that mattered now. In the eyes of the Whitmore heirs, he was only a servant. The family whispered accusations of manipulation, of seduction, of schemes too vulgar to name. They spoke as if love and loyalty were currency to be bought, as if Adrian could never have been anything but a shadow clinging to their father's fading years. The lawyer, steady despite the chaos, reaffirmed the words of the will. The decision was final, sealed, and witnessed. The empire of Whitmore Industries had been entrusted to Adrian Carter alone. The chandelier above cast fractured light over the marble floor as the family's grief curdled into fury. To them, Charles's last act was not a gift of gratitude, but a betrayal. They could not comprehend that wealth could belong to someone they dismissed as less, someone whose very identity they had mocked. And as Adrian sat in silence, listening to the storm gather and the voices around him, he felt the sharp edge of truth press into his heart. Family is not always defined by inheritance or bloodlines. Sometimes it is revealed in the final breath of a man who chose love over legacy. For those watching, the lesson was hidden in plain sight. The true measure of worth is not what we demand from others, but what we quietly give when no one else is watching. This is only the beginning of Adrian's journey. Stay with Heart Stories, because what follows will test not only his strength, but the meaning of family itself. The night after the will was read, the Whitmore mansion echoed with anger. Victoria locked herself in her father's old study, pacing beneath oil portraits as if sheer will could undo the humiliation. Daniel drowned his bitterness in whiskey, muttering that Adrian Carter would never last. Yet when the family stormed out, vowing to contest everything in court, Adrian remained in the corner, silent. His silence was not weakness. It was the discipline of someone who had lived too long under the weight of judgment. someone who understood that storms often burn themselves out. The following morning, the family gathered again, summoned by the lawyer who now carried a small recorder and a sealed envelope. The family's fury simmered, but the lawyer's voice was firm as he explained that Charles Whitmore had prepared something none of them could dispute. He pressed play. The room shifted, the bitterness momentarily replaced by the voice of the man they had buried only days before. Charles's words filled the chamber with a trembling calm. He spoke of frailty, of nights when the pain had been too great to rise from bed, of mornings when loneliness sat heavier than his fortune. And each time, Adrian was there reading aloud the books Charles once loved, arranging chess pieces on the board even when the old man could no longer lift his hand, steadying him when illness threatened to strip away his dignity. Charles's tone carried no malice toward his children. He did not condemn Victoria or Daniel for their absence, but his meaning was unmistakable. "This is not punishment," the recording said. "It is recognition. Wealth should reward not only blood but loyalty. Adrian gave me back my humanity in the end. That is worth more than inheritance." The lawyer then revealed the conditions attached to the estate. Adrian would not simply inherit by default. He was charged with carrying out Charles's final wishes, a series of tasks rooted in love rather than ambition. The Grand Whitmore Library, locked for decades, must be open to the public as a sanctuary for learning. The sprawling gardens, neglected by the family, must be restored as a living place of reflection. The ashes of Charles Whitmore were to be taken to the sea, and there Adrian must read aloud passages from the books they had shared. And more, he was to serve within the community, offering his hands where others offered only their wallets. The weight of these conditions fell upon Adrian's shoulders like stone. Failure in any of them would not mean the fortune fell to Victoria or Daniel. Instead, every cent, every property, every share of Whitmore Industries would vanish into the hands of charity. The heirs would receive nothing. The rage in Victoria's eyes could have cut glass. Daniel slammed his fist on the table, declaring the tasks impossible, convinced that Adrian was doomed to fail. They whispered to each other that they would ensure it. Already they imagined ways to sabotage the library opening, to derail his work in the community, to see him stumble beneath the impossible expectations of a dead man's will. Adrian, however, did not protest. He sat still, listening to the crackle of the recording, as if each word were not a burden, but a call. When the playback ended, the lawyer placed a second envelope before Adrian. On its surface was written in Charles's neat script, "Only open when you doubt yourself." Adrian touched the seal but did not break it. Some truths, he knew, required the right moment. As the family filed out, their whispers thick with venom, Adrian lingered in the quiet that followed. He felt the enormity of the road ahead. The fortune was not his reward but a responsibility. It would not be measured in the wealth he controlled, but in the dignity he carried forward for the man who had trusted him. There was a lesson carved into this moment, though few in that room could see it. Legacy is not built by inheritance or marble estates. It is carved in the kindness we leave behind, in the way we lift others when the world would rather turn away. The first weeks of Adrian Carter's new life did not begin with champagne or celebration. They began with dust, heavy books, and the quiet determination of a man carrying the weight of a promise. The Whitmore Library, sealed for decades, opened its doors to the public on a gray morning. Children wandered through aisles that once belonged only to billionaires, their laughter soft against the smell of polished oak and aging paper. Volunteers stepped forward, eager to help. Yet behind the joy, shadows lingered. Contracts for maintenance were suddenly canceled without explanation. A company hired to deliver new furniture backed out at the last moment. The whispers of sabotage were everywhere, though no one dared name the source aloud. Adrian pressed forward. When the library doors closed each evening, he moved to the gardens, pruning and planting where vines had strangled statues and fountains lay broken. The earth gave no pity, but his hands did not falter. Still, accidents followed. Tools disappeared. A delivery truck full of saplings turned back at the gate, claiming the order had been withdrawn. Even the irrigation system, newly repaired, was mysteriously sabotaged overnight. To most, it would seem like misfortune. To Adrian, it was clear. Victoria and Daniel were weaving their traps with silent precision, determined to prove him unworthy. The greatest trial came not from soil or stone, but from suspicion. One morning, when Adrian carried the urn of Charles Whitmore to the sea, a patrol car pulled into the lot. Officers approached with questions sharpened like knives, insisting on permits, demanding explanations. It was a moment designed to humiliate, to frighten him into surrender. Yet Adrian's calmness disarmed them. He spoke with the quiet dignity of someone who knew he had nothing to hide. The officers left empty-handed, but the message was clear. Eyes were on him, waiting for a mistake. It was during these storms that Dr. Miller stepped forward. My mom, the physician, who had once been Charles's confidant, recognized the invisible war being waged. He arranged new suppliers when old contracts collapsed. He vouched for Adrian when officials came with questions. His presence did not erase the obstacles, but it gave Adrian the steady ground he needed to continue. Together, they reopened the library after each disruption, restored the gardens despite ruined shipments, and carried out the service projects that Charles had demanded. The Whitmore heirs grew more restless with every success. Victoria's voice on the phone grew colder, instructing lawyers to find loopholes in the will. Daniel prowled the mansion halls like a caged predator, hiring private investigators to follow Adrian's every move. They were no longer simply angry, they were desperate. To them, the idea that Adrian might succeed was unbearable. If he completed the tasks, the empire was gone forever. And still, Adrian endured. His back ached from hours bent over the soil. His hands carried the marks of splinters from bookshelves too long neglected. He returned home each night to the echo of loneliness, yet rose each dawn with the same quiet vow. This was not about wealth. It was about honoring a man who had trusted him with dignity when no one else had. What unfolded in those months was more than a battle over inheritance. It was a war between two visions of legacy, one built on entitlement and bloodlines, and one built on labor, loyalty, and love. Adrian's path was lined with traps, but each time he stumbled, he rose again, not through anger, but through persistence. The lesson was not hidden in riches or marble estates. It lived in the patience to rebuild a garden no one believed in the courage to walk toward the sea with the weight of ashes. Even under suspicion, true strength does not always roar in defiance. Sometimes it is found in the silence of a man who refuses to quit, even when the world conspires to see him fall. The appointed day arrived under a pale sky that seemed to hold its breath. Adrian Carter walked to the shoreline, carrying the urn of Charles Whitmore, the man whose voice still echoed in memory. The sea stretched endless before him, restless but calm enough to listen. Adrian lowered himself onto the sand, opened the pages of an old volume, and began to read aloud. The same words he had once spoken beside a sickbed now drifted across the waves. When he finished, he tipped the urn, letting the ashes scatter into the wind. Each grain carried toward the horizon like fragments of a life released. As the final act of the will's conditions, Adrian reached into his coat and drew out the envelope marked in Charles's hand, "Only open when you doubt yourself." His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of arrival. He broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Inside lay a message of quiet strength, a reassurance written for the moment when shadows seemed most overwhelming. Alongside it was a small USB drive, the kind of object easy to overlook, yet heavy with meaning. Adrian pressed it to his chest, understanding that this was meant not for him alone, but for the world. The following morning, the Whitmore Library, now a place alive with voices of children, scholars, and neighbors, was filled with reporters, flashing cameras, and the sharp murmur of expectation. A podium stood at the front where Adrian, with the lawyer by his side, placed the USB into a computer. The crowd hushed as the screen lit up and the familiar face of Charles Whitmore appeared. The room seemed to fold inward, every breath caught in the pause before his voice began. Charles spoke not as a titan of business, but as a man stripped of titles. He confessed that his fortune had brought him power, but not presence. His children had inherited access to everything, but had given nothing back when his body failed him. Adrian gave me what money could not. His voice declared, he gave me dignity. He gave me the comfort of being seen not as a name, but as a man. Gasps rippled through the hall. Some reporters lowered their cameras, as though the weight of those words was too raw to frame. At the back, Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line, her fury barely contained. Daniel's jaw tightened, and when the video ended, both stormed out, leaving behind the whispers of shame that clung to them like shadows. Adrian remained at the podium, unable to stop the tears that blurred his vision. They were not tears of triumph, but of release. For so long, his life had been framed by whispers of dismissal, by the silent judgment of those who believed him unworthy because he loved differently, because he came from nowhere to belong. And now, in front of the strangers and friends alike, the truth had been spoken by the very man who had once defined an empire. It was not just inheritance, it was vindication. The library that day became more than a hall of books. It became a stage for a legacy rewritten. Adrian did not raise his voice to claim victory. He let the silence speak for him, the silence of a man who had endured ridicule, sabotage, and doubt, only to rise with grace when truth finally stepped into the light. The deeper lesson lay not in the scandal of fortune or the collapse of family pride, but in the reminder that value is not measured by bloodlines or entitlement. It is measured by presence, by showing up when someone is at their weakest, by standing when others turn away. The words of Charles Whitmore did more than settle an estate. They reminded everyone listening that love, freely given and quietly lived, can leave behind a legacy stronger than wealth. The days following the public revelation carried a strange calm. The empire of Charles Whitmore no longer belonged to those who had expected it. Victoria and Daniel retreated into silence, their lawyers powerless before the clarity of their father's words. Reporters still camped outside the gates, eager for one last headline, one more scandal to chase. Yet Adrian Carter moved quietly through the mansion, now less a palace of marble pride and more a vessel of memory. He had completed every task. He had opened the library, restored the gardens, given his time to strangers, and carried the ashes of Charles to the sea. By the strict letter of the will, nothing remained undone. But Adrian knew there was one truth still unspoken. The USB had revealed the gratitude of Charles, but not the full story. The world still saw Adrian as a servant who had been lifted by fortune's whim. The Whitmore heirs painted him as a manipulator who exploited an old man's weakness. And though the conditions of the will had been met, Adrian understood that silence could let those lies grow like weeds. He remembered the envelope Charles had written, the message meant to steady him when doubt pressed hardest. In it was a line few had noticed: "When the time comes, let the world know you were never a stranger to me." So Adrian prepared himself for the final act. He stood once more in the Whitmore Library, this time not before lawyers or judges, but before the community who had come to witness history. Reporters crowded in, cameras flashing. He let the noise settle, then stepped to the podium. His voice was steady, though his hands curled slightly at the edges of the speech he carried. He told them a secret Charles had shielded for years. Adrian was not just a caretaker who had walked into the Whitmore household by chance. He had once been a boy in a scholarship program that Charles quietly funded, a child with no family name and no inheritance. Charles had seen him then, fragile and unwanted, and had chosen to protect him. But because Adrian was openly gay in a world still quick to wound, Charles kept the truth from his children, fearing their cruelty would break him before he had the chance to grow. To the Whitmore heirs, Adrian remained the outsider. But to Charles, he had always been something else: family, hidden but no less real. The room stilled. The words fell with the weight of finality, not as defense but as truth unveiled. Adrian raised his head, eyes shining not with victory, but with release. "He left me his fortune," Adrian said softly, "not to shame his children, but to acknowledge me as his own, not by blood, but by choice." Wow. The silence was heavy, broken only by the clicking of cameras, capturing a man who no longer looked like a servant, but a son standing tall in the legacy of a father's decision. Outside the mansion, the story spread across headlines. For some, it was scandal. For others, it was redemption. Yet for many listening, it was proof that family could be defined not by bloodlines, but by the love that refused to let someone fall forgotten. The Whitmores were left with nothing but the echo of their father's disappointment. Adrian walked forward carrying not just wealth, but the weight of example. He had become a symbol, not of money won, but of dignity earned. His journey stood as a reminder that family is not inherited, it is built through love, sacrifice, and the courage to stand when the world calls you unworthy. And now I turn to you. Do you believe Charles Whitmore's choice was justice, or betrayal was Adrian's inheritance, the breaking of a family, or the making of one? Tell me what you think in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share so you never miss another story here on Heart Stories.